Hello, and welcome to the Spec Shaman Podcast, the show that explores the world of building product manufacturers, architects, and engineers, sustainable design, and technology and trends. We engage in thought-provoking discussions with renowned experts, industry pioneers, and visionaries who are making a significant impact in the construction industry. Join us as we explore groundbreaking ideas, revolutionary concepts, and the latest advancements shaping the built environment. The Spec Shaman Podcast is hosted by Laura Elliott, the lead instructional designer at Ron Blank and Associates. Laura is a seasoned interviewer with a passion for uncovering the untold stories behind success. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Let's get started.
Welcome to the Blueprint of Outdoor Living podcast. I'm Laura Elliott, and I'm joined here today with Jeff Sarovi, Architectural Sales Manager for Keylink, and Jason Fora, VP of Marketing Development. Combined, these gentlemen have decades of experience in manufacturing and wholesale building materials distribution across various product lines and bring a wealth of expertise to the table. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Laura.
I'm excited to kick off this second episode of this wonderful series. And we're going to look at some code compliance and challenges over engineering and perfect builds. So let's get it started. Can you explain the importance of code compliance in construction projects?
Laura, I'll take a stab at that. Code compliance is set in the United States by the International Code Council, ICC, and it breaks it out into two separate categories, the International Building Code and the International Residential Code. Most of our product and references to in our podcast will be focused on residential applications. Therefore, the IRC, the International Residential Code, will be the code that we oftentimes refer to.
So what are the common code challenges that you see contractors face on a day-to-day?
Yeah, the biggest challenge, I think, is just consistency. Every code jurisdiction is different, although they all adopt some form of the code. It's interpretation. And so, Steve mentioned it in his portion, but knowing who your local code official is, knowing what they're looking for, knowing what those nuances maybe are, it's going to help you be a better contractor, a better design professional, for sure, because there are some discrepancies. There are a couple places in the country where they still do not allow, even though it's code, they don't allow horizontal cable. And we know that, they reintroduced that back in early 2000s, right, Jeff?
Correct.
And they approved it. And so, but there are some locations, Fairfax, Virginia, Fairfax County doesn't like you to do that, and parts of Chicago are also in the same, interpretation of that code. So it's just important to know, it helps you to better plan. It helps you to better set better expectations with your clients, and helps you keep things on track, in a timely fashion also.
When we look at code compliance for contractors typically falls into the anchorage of the railing post to the substrate. Could be a wood, a deck made out of composite material with a wood substructure. We're starting to see today a lot of new materials coming into the structures, structural components for decks, aluminum components, steel components. Typically, we look at how that product is, the post is anchored into that structure. Additionally, code also requires certain deflections. Deflection is also a consideration for code compliance. Railings today must meet or exceed the requirements set forth by the ICC for deflection, both at the post, in the center of the post, at the post brackets. We test the post, and we all test them as a manufacturer. I speak for my company, Keylink. We test them to the point of failure and beyond to create the best possible product out there.
So how do municipalities handle inspection challenges?
As Jay mentioned before, it comes down to interpretation. First and foremost, the ICC updates the code every 3 years. The most current code that we're looking at today is the 2024 code, which will be revisited over the next 3 years and reintroduced again with changes in 2027. So depending on the state typically adopts a code year. Many states today are 2018, 2021. very few changes from 21 to 24. But however, there's a process in which all that is then incorporated into state codes and then downstream down to the local municipalities. It's important as we speak to architects and designers alike to know what code year the state and subsequent municipality is working with, so that we have an understanding of which direction we're going in, and knowing that up front.
Yeah, it's definitely a tangle. You know,
It is
all
a
the
tangle
different,
indeed.
yeah,
And,
fire safety is the
we even
same
get
thing.
into the point where, I'm sorry, Laura, I didn't mean to speak over you, but we even get into a point where there's interpretation. They read a document or a subsection of the code, and it's in how one interprets that. And there's a process in which, if it's interpreted a certain way, there's a challenge process, or a process in which we can go back as either a manufacturer or a contractor to go back and have that reviewed once again. But it is interesting. Now, many things are up to interpretation.
And one of the biggest loopholes on that, or at least discrepancies that I would see, is the lighting code. You know, they state in the lighting code that you have to have visual light to go down through the stairs and hit the landing at the bottom of that stair structure. And last time I checked, I've never seen anyone in the code system come out after dark and use a light meter to see if that light actually gets to the bottom. So yeah, I mean, you need to have your stairs lit up, right? So we typically tell people on stairs, as a good rule, there are some things you may have to do above and beyond. When we talk about what separates and maybe makes a better contractor or a better design professional, being aware of that and knowing maybe there is a discrepancy, you can just be proactive and adjust it accordingly.
Yeah, the term lighted paths of egress is part of the code, and it takes on a meaning for both residential and more so for commercial applications. Commercially speaking, you're liable for injury if it's not properly lighted. There's some challenges there. We're just working on a project right now that we're spending a lot of time and energy around making certain that the lighting aspect for the ramps and the stairways are more than adequate because of the liability challenges that are present.
So lighting is a key consideration. How do we look at welding and hardware? Are there key considerations for welding materials in construction?
Most of the manufacturers today in the residential space are constructing their railing systems with anchorage into the post with a type of sheet metal screw or a self-tapping screw, if I may. The posts are anchored into the substrate. Depending on what that substrate is, it's typically a anchor of a certain diameter and length, preferred with a nut and washer on the bottom, so that it's anchored securely into that structure. Welding seldom is used in the residential side. However, you may have some shop built or some other types of assemblies that on a commercial basis may have some welding involved with that. However, there's certain prescribed methods in welding, making sure that the material's clean after that prior to finishing. Jay mentioned earlier, there's some challenges out there that you have to be very aware of when welding on site.
Yeah, some of those challenges really come down to, do you have a consistent testing method? If you're getting items done from a custom fabrication shop, when we work with the folks at Keylink, they test their posts on a certain increment and they test them for failure. So they know that, there's a lot of metrics behind that are very accurate and very time proven. Whereas if you're getting a custom job done, and not only does steel, corrode, and it can have problems, being on the coast and then with water in general, there's not a really good method of testing when those products are made custom.
So when we're looking at hardware and fasteners, how are they used to up a standard?
Well, let's go back to my wheelhouse, which is aluminum railing assemblies. And manufacturers today, including my company, are manufacturing systems that are designed to be incorporated with the post that is provided by that manufacturer, and subsequently the fastener or the anchorage method from the railing section into that post is prescribed and tested. Oftentimes, it's even supplied. What is not supplied in these instances would be the anchorage of the post to that substrate, because we just don't know as a manufacturer, and I'm speaking all manufacturers, do not know what that substrate is going to be. There's recommendations for those post anchorage, but there is not a prescribed fastener. I'm glad to work with engineers, and I've worked on some projects already where we've had to go out and have an engineer describe or prescribe a anchorage method with a particular diameter and length of post and the threading, so on and so forth. And that's available. We're glad to do that if we need to. But day in and day out, contractors typically purchase a anchor from their building supply, material supply house, and they use them. The biggest challenge would be oftentimes that they're using a lag screw, not a lag bolt, that typically would require a nut and washer detail, and oftentimes a bracket, almost like an elongated washer to support that. We're not worried about the post failing. We're worried about the connection failing through that blocking, hence the detail that we test for and demonstrate in the drawings pretty much across the industry.
So, what are the most critical aspects of working with contractors?
Setting expectations. Oftentimes, contractors are looking for products that, hopefully they're looking for products that meet or exceed code requirements. Manufacturers today in our space will be producing products that meet or exceed code, but it's ultimately up to the contractor. There's products available from all over the globe. We're, a global society now. People can buy product online. It doesn't mean it's necessarily tested. So they need to make certain that we're setting expectations. Those critical aspects would be code compliance and making certain that they have the correct product for that.
I think it's equally important, when you're looking at those expectations, to know what your suppliers can get. We have a lot of folks, there's a lot of special order products you can get, which are great, typically 4 to 5 week lead times. But, what ends up happening inevitably is if you don't know exactly what your local distribution channel has on the ground, you may be let down because you miss one part and then you can't get it, or you ordered something online and maybe it's out of stock. Maybe it's something that, you're not familiar with. So pick products that the local manufacturing, talk to your local manufacturers, talk to your local supply chains, figure out and know what you're getting, opposed to on a whim, just letting your client pick a product that they saw online and it looked nice and shiny like a fishing lure, and you follow it to your demise. It's not always the most efficient path just because you saw it on the website.
Talk about an extended lead time,
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So how do we incorporate HSW, health, safety, and welfare, into regulations that influence construction projects?
Well, I think just making sure that your contractors, again, and your design professionals are up to speed on what those codes are and what those products they're specifying. There are companies that will have products available that don't meet, IRC code ratings. And we see a lot of this in multifamily where, you have a very competitive bid on a very large job. Most of those jobs for multifamily are probably going to run 6 figures or more. Tendency, right, would be to lean in and go and get, I can save 5% or I can save 10%. And they don't go that route. Again, having another person you can lean on to give a good recommendation. Jeff and I are just working on a project right now in Myrtle Beach with a contractor where he came to me with an example of what to do. I gave him the examples that meet commercial, right, 42 high. But he also was within a mile of the coast. And I said, you really need to use a coastal coating, a 2605 powder coating. There's so many companies out there that don't even offer a 2605. So, again, he could have easily pushed that project through because they were asking for his recommendation. They weren't asking for a specific 2605. So knowing what specs are, knowing, again, just knowing people in the industry that you can lean on, that's really important. I can't stress that enough. I think relationships are still important. We still value those in our business. I see more and more of a trend, though, moved away from that in some ways on a small percentage, and they just do it because the attraction of a lower price catches their eye, and it's not always worth it. So
that can always lead to some legal complications if you are bottom dollaring a project and you don't really understand the compliance and the safety and the performance that you need to have for a project. And I think there's always like an evolutionary cycle happening there where, people will say, well, this is cost effective, but it really isn't in the long term because you can run into some significant challenges, especially in commercial spaces. So, are there other legal considerations that contractors should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, as far as Jeff can cover that, but as far as making sure you're tested and code rated, right? If people fall off of a high balcony, I mean, that's I stayed in a local hotel chain, you know, worldwide, and at the beach, and they obviously had specified steel, and the steel components were rusted. They were extremely rusted. So, I mean, at what level does failure happen there? Does it have to happen where someone leans in with some kids and they fall off to their death? I mean, it does happen in America, unfortunately, very sadly, but it shouldn't have to be that way, right? You shouldn't have steel, my opinion, with fittings on the coast. They're going to corrode, and there's nobody there with the corroding meter, waiting for things to corrode. And we know that they're compromised once that happens.
One of the aspects that's happened over the last, I'll say 10 or 15 years now, is that contractors must be registered within the state. Living in Pennsylvania, as I do, each contractor must have a state registration. I know in many states today, not only do they have to be registered or licensed, if I may, within their state that they work in, but they also have to take continuing ed. Education programs to maintain those registrations or licenses within the state. So we're building a better process and education for the contractors. Both Jay and I participate in trade shows and events similar to that provide that level of education that contractors are looking for and that need. So that helps them.
It's also why they're more money in some cases, right? Going with the lower bid, I mean, you can only get so much, right? If you want expertise, unfortunately, you have to pay for it. It's just part of the process. Now, you want to make sure people sharpen their pencils, but there's a reason why those folks have better expectations set because they have expertise, right? They have experience and they know the right people to talk to. Hey, I'm doing a project on the coast. What do you think? And they get the right information because of the context that they have. It's easy to cut corners and just, go in a direction and make something up, and then you have to deal with all that on the back end with liability and litigation.
And that's why it was so cool to talk to Mike Boudre last episode and what Nadra is doing in order to try to advance education and create a collaborative place where people can come understand what's happening in the industry and it's cohesive. He even
Agreed.
mentioned that they're doing links directly to the correct specifications and things like that. And I think that that's brilliant. The more that we can streamline education points and not make it complicated so people can all be on the same page, the better.
Well, and that's some of the things too. I think that are a little misleading. The states come out with this contractor program, and they have no way of policing it as a continuing ed program. That's what's great about the AIA community, right? They do require continuing ed, and it's really important. Where a lot of states do it, in my opinion, more as a tax grab, and they don't follow it back up with continuing ed, and that's not the right way to do it. So work with your states to provide that. Ask for it. You should have a contractor. The license doesn't mean anything without interest, expertise, and improvement.
I currently am working, we've done some work in North Carolina with regards to providing education for contractors. And I'm currently in conversation with a colleague of mine and one of our distributor partners, one of your colleagues, Jay, in Wisconsin to develop some content for contractors for their licensing. So it's an ongoing conversation that we're having right now. What that content or the learning must look like, what does it contain, and meeting all the requirements that the state of Wisconsin has. So that state in particular is doing a really nice job with that requirement, and I'm glad to be a part of that.
Yeah, there's definitely a space where there's no shortage of things to learn, and solid rigor in creating programming really matters. You can create a compliance, make sure you have this continuing ed, but the continuing ed also has to have great value to it. It can't be fluffy, it needs to be integral. And working in this space for a while, it's definitely something that I see make a difference. When people get properly educated on the materials and the process and the codes, it is a huge difference in performance and how they build and how they design. So I couldn't agree more. So what are some of the proven practices for building backyard decks? Like, just what are the best things that you see?
Laura, you mentioned our first episode, back to our first episode, and Mike Boudry from the North American Deck and Rail Association, NADRA, as we know them. The NADRA organization spends a lot of time in working down channel with the contractors. They offer programs, deck inspection, decks done right. Building Code College, Glenn Mathewson has an extensive program for education purposes, and I find it fascinating. I, along with a number of my colleagues here at Keylink, had participated in the Building Code College Master Deck Professional Code course, and it was great benefit for us. And that information's out there for contractors, and I highly recommend that contractors research NADRA, decks done right, deck inspection, to help find those best practices in building decks. They may know, they may have knowledge today, but that knowledge is ever evolving. Materials are ever evolving. We've spoken about that before. Techniques or methodology is improving and the like. So it's critical to reach out and find a trusted advisor. I think that's we've talked about that a few times indirectly, but finding a trusted advisor, it could be somebody from a manufacturer like myself, or a distributor representative like Jay, even your local building supply yard. Find somebody that you trust, that knows that they have your best interest in heart, and that because you're going to give you the proper guidance. It's not about the sale. It's about making certain it's the right product for the right application.
And we, in fact, for our, branded decking, we have our own Wolf Pro training program, and we offer a 5-year labor component, so we go through all the best practices that are good and bad, that are really important. And it's about an hour class. It doesn't cost anything to the contractor. I personally trained probably 5,000 in the last decade, and it's just been very valuable for me to really, and I really enjoy it, getting in front of the contractors and learning from them, but also sharing that information that I've learned. And so lean on those, companies that offer some type of training program, not just the, hey, fill out this form and you're certified, but actually have a learning unit available.
Yeah, I definitely see that as an impact. When you mentioned something earlier, and I've always been curious about this. Everyone says to find a trusted advisor. How much bandwidth does every rep have to be that person? Like, are you working with hundreds of different people for hundreds of different projects? Do you have like a close network of 50 people that will contact you depending on their project? Because I think sometimes there might be a hesitancy, right, to reach out because people might have the impression that you might be busy, and it might be difficult.
Yeah, with the numbers that I've hit, yeah, I mean, some guys will. I think it's a comfort level. I think it's also indicative of men in our industry, right? They learn, and maybe they feel that they kind of figured it out. But in general, I mean, the fact that they were willing to go through a training is, it's 85% of it. But there is a bandwidth thing, of course. There's only so many people I can talk to in a week, and same with Jeff. Our time is it's pretty busy.
Yeah.
And I cover like Jeff, a very large footprint. So yeah, I mean, the bandwidth's there, but like I tell folks, it's not hard for me to identify a situation and just text me. And, I'll answer you. It could be maybe in a day, but I usually get back to somebody right away. It's texting is the best way for me because I can see a picture, I can identify a problem, and I can give a quick answer.
That's cool. Because I wonder, because, that's one of the things I think it's such an important moment in design, in the process of what we're doing, what we're building, right? And, those connections between people, especially with the younger generation coming up being really, digitally oriented and things like that, that reach out touch base is not necessarily an instinctual thing. But it's such a value thing because you can't really upload a picture. I mean, I guess you could probably do it. You could probably be like, what's this photo and what's wrong with it? And AI might be able to give recommendations, but that's not going to have that on-site expertise that you gentlemen carry, so.
And I tell you that a lot of the folks are utilizing Instagram and reaching out and sharing that community, kind of a brethren of contractors reaching out and seeing what other folks are doing, and then even asking a question, oh, hey, what are you using? I like what you posted there. And I know many guys that are talking around the country, which is really great to see. It only helps us all become better and share knowledge.
That's a good pro tip, social media.
And Instagram is one of my favorite. Yeah. Sorry, Jeff.
No, quite all right. I just going back to this trusted advisor concept. I've been calling on architects in the architectural community since the early 1990s, and I still have colleagues that I've met, architects that I met 30 some years ago that still reach out to me for different things because we've built a friendship around that trusted advisor role
Hmm.
and knowing that we had each other's best interest in mind. So I recommend whether a contractor is listening to this program today, it's an architect, find your trusted advisor. And it's more than one. And I've had architects contact me about a product line I knew nothing about, but I knew somebody that knew that. And because I knew a colleague that may have sold roofing, for example, I was able to put those two people together to create another trusted advisory type of relationship. So again, leverage those relationships, those trusting relationships, and expand upon that. It's critical to have those relationships, whether you're a contractor or an architect. I feel very strongly about that, and I'm thankful that I was able to create them in my career.
And you probably have a lot of firsthand knowledge on the testing methods and how that goes down and how that can impact what you would say depending on what they needed to know about. What are some
Sure.
testing methods that are used to ensure the quality of construction materials?
Well, speaking specifically about railing, the IC, going back to the International Code Council, the ICC mandates or stipulates primarily it's related to deflection testing standards. Will the product be tested and meet or exceed the testing requirements? We reference back to the acceptance criteria, ICC acceptance criteria 273, which references ASTM standards E935 and 985. I'll talk about that in my presentation, which gives the prescription for all that testing for deflection. One of the biggest changes in deflection testing methodology happened from the 15 to the 18 code. And there was, again, not to get into the math of it, but there was a significant change in that testing where the formula was changed. And now it's just basically the deflection is a calculation of L over 96, the length divided by 96. And in case of an 8-foot section length, you're only allowed to have 1 inch of deflection on that railing section. In addition, it must return to normal within a 1/4 inch of the test, the baseline testing. So
Wow.
there's some very prescribed testing that's out there, and manufacturers in this space today, uh, national manufacturers in the space today will meet or exceed that. And I just, again, I'm not going to mention any names because I don't have any names, but I just make certain that if an architect is specifying a product or a contractor selecting a product, make certain that the testing information is up to date and that it's valid. And that's the legal end of it to protect themselves. Again, that's very critical in my mind, and making certain that the post and railing, all those connections are tested properly.
So, how do commercial and residential construction projects differ in this regard?
Well, back to the ICC, they have the International Building Code, which is commercial projects or non-residential project, and the IRC. So when we look at deflection, deflection is calculated 50 pounds per square foot, 50 pounds per lineal foot of railing section versus 20 pounds per lineal foot for IRC or the residential code. So manufacturers like my company and others will test at the IBC standard, the 50 pounds per lineal foot of deflection. Therefore, if we pass that, we automatically pass the IRC because it's a lower standard. Manufacturers out there that only test the IRC standards. So you've got to be careful about that. They may provide you a 42-inch height railing, but it may not meet commercial ICC, IBC standards. And you have to be very careful about it. The devil's in the details and the specs and the testing. So again, I'm just throwing it out there. Ask questions, find that trusted advisor to give you the guidance that you need to make certain that the product that you're selecting for the project is correct.
Cutting corners is a big challenge, right? How do you manage that challenge and the cost of competition in the construction industry?
You manage it, I think, by just, getting the word out there. We do a lot of pull through. We do a lot of downstreaming. We do a lot of events. We do a lot of educating. and just explaining, how our products fit. There's definitely, and you can find lower priced products, but usually you find with them with a lower warranty. And as you step up, you're giving away a little bit of it for warranty. It still meets code in a lot of cases. And as an example of decking, a product that's going to be ranged in the $2.50 a linear foot to $3 a foot is going to have a lower warranty than a product that's going to have maybe a 50-year warranty. But you'll pay more for that. And there may be differences. Cap composite can't directly be touching water where PVC decking can. So depending on where you're using it, right? Again, back to the expertise. I've seen so many people use a cap composite board, right on a lake or right near water, and if you read their their guidelines, it's not going to meet their warranty. So it's just there's a lot of mud to sling out there. To Jeff's point, we can't. I say episode 2, we can't preach this enough, but find a trusted advisor, find people that you can trust, know your partners, know your availability, have them help you with code and breaking through some of that clutter and helping you with some of, reading it, finding it, streamlining it, and work with good partners.
Jay mentioned warranty, and warranty is a big aspect. Manufacturers in this space, offer warranties. Again, reading that warranty carefully, oftentimes there will be a residential aspect of that warranty. If the material is used in a commercial application, that warranty may change ever so slightly. And I just want to make sure that the contractor and the architect would know that to be looked at very carefully.
So can you explain the concept of over-engineering and its implications in this conversation?
Well, you could over-engineer something. Again, it really comes down to budget and what you're trying to accomplish. Like I had said, technically, that HOA that we're working on the coast could have absolutely installed a product by code that had a 2604 AMA coating. Was it right by their clients? It wouldn't have been, but they over-engineered it to do the right thing, and code sometimes doesn't always cover that,
And that also ties back to the warranty, because manufacturers within a mile of the coast, they're not going to warrant a standard finish. They would only warrant the product if it had the upgraded coastal finish. So again, tying both warranty and over-engineering setting expectations, it's just having that conversation. If they ultimately decide to go with a product that's not going to be warranted or less than, we've done our job, it comes down to cost considerations. That's frustrating. Railing, unlike my previous life where I was in fenestration, we were on the front end of the project. Decking and railing are at the tail end of the projects, especially in commercial projects where they're looking to due to scope creep or overruns in other areas. Cost-wise, they're looking to cut back in material expense or labor expense and the like. So there's always some challenges out there.
So what does the perfect build look like, especially in an outdoor space?
What makes a best project, making a happy customer, right? Setting expectations, working with a client who can work on a timely budget and really just meet their expectations. It could be a small 12 by 12 deck. It could be a monster that's, $100,000 or more. Really just making happy customers. And that happens by using the right partners, the right products, and the right advisors to help accomplish that. And the right contractor. You hear a lot of people say, I'm working with a chuck and a truck, and no offense to the chucks out there, but they'll use that term in the sense where it doesn't take a lot to get into the outdoor living business, right? It's really just some basic carpentry skills, so people think, until you start looking at all the details involved, right? The fireplaces and the roofs and the ledger components, and then your fasteners. Do I go 12 on center? Do I go 16? And then the bombardment in the industry with 8 or 10 different decking products, 8 or 10 different railing products. And everybody tells you they have the best product, right? My biggest pet peeve with sales guys, when they say things like, we have the best, or I'm the best. It doesn't mean anything, right? It means nothing. So, talk to somebody who can deliver with you with best practices. Everything has a pro and a con. I like to sell on application selling. It's important to understand and include those partners in your project. The amount of expertise that's out there that's available is invaluable. Find the right people, and they can help you to make that best project.
Well, I couldn't agree more with the points that you're making, and I'm really glad that we got to have a good discussion, especially around code compliance, because I think you're right. I think there's a big range, right? Some people do think it's just I can go swing a hammer, so I can go build this deck, and it's so much more complicated than that, and the liability involved in doing it wrong can really impact lives across the board, not only for the owner, but for the person that installed the deck and all the different outdoor living elements. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to discuss those things, especially even just where the light falls. I mean, that's such an important consideration, especially in commercial applications, but in all applications. So I'd like to welcome Hunter Johnson, the founder and chief executive officer of the Tano Group, who provides turnkey project delivery solutions and is a family of companies. Hi, Hunter. Welcome.
Well, good morning.
Well, I'd love to get right into this conversation, and I can't think of anyone better to discuss code compliance with. So, how do you approach the integration of new building codes into existing projects?
Of course, code in general is such an exciting topic. So I'm sure so many people are going to be riveted by this part of it, but we'll try to make it interesting if we can. I think where you really have to kind of begin that part of the conversation is to understand that code in general is an always evolving, changing, workable dynamic. It has to address, evolving physical conditions in the environment, building technologies and material methods that are changing. And of course, so much of it is driven by insurance claims. That's just the reality of what code is. I think one of the things you really need to understand too, and the precedent of this is that there is a marked difference between the residential code. There's a specific international residential code that is different necessarily from what we would call the international building code, or to get really technical, the international existing building code. So for commercial projects or multifamily residential. One of the big differences I think people need to understand is with residential, there is a lot more leniency, generally speaking. You're talking about private, residential environments versus something that the public may encounter, where we're dealing with, commercial environments. Ultimately, though, I think where the safeguards have to exist and where people need to understand the impacts is that this all boils down to the local jurisdiction. Ultimately, the local code official has final authority. That's really what it says in Chapter 1. It gives them the ability to kind of make their own interpretations. Of course, code is a guideline. It's enforceable by law. But at the same time, you've got to look at every circumstance separately. And existing buildings have far more leniency because they do exist. There are parameters that we have to look at that give, again, the local jurisdiction far more leniency to deal with those conditions than maybe if you're building something brand new. Ultimately, we always tell people you got to think of it from this perspective. It all boils down to one word, which is liability. Who does the liability get borne by, and how do you address these issues as you go into your building project? And we'll get into some of this, I think, later, but in terms of kind of the process itself.
As you work in different areas or different regions or different sectors, I'm sure you encounter like that local code authority having the final say. How do you create innovative solutions to overcome some challenges with code compliance?
Yeah, that's a great question because again, the building code is intended to be a guideline. To some degree, it can be prescriptive, but it isn't intended to be the way in which you design the project. It's not a step-by-step process. And so, it is intended to give that creativity to the design professional or the builder, whoever is actually executing the project. I think when you think about outdoor spaces, and particularly I'll kind of put them into the broader category of like recreational amenity type environments, it can get tricky. And I think the expectations are often changing on, what people want out of an outdoor, space like that. For example, swimming pools and spas and water features are an ever-growing, very popular, especially since the pandemic. Everybody seems to want their home vacation option. And every jurisdiction will have a little bit of a different take on some of the protective mechanisms that need to be in place to keep open water sources like swimming pools safe. Most commonly, there needs to be some sort of perimeter barrier to keep, children or pets or whomever from wandering into the space and falling into the pool. Often it's a 4-foot fence, or at least it's defined that way. But I think there can be creative solutions that move away from something so stereotypical and maybe even unsightly or non-integrated into a plan, a landscape plan, for example. So some code, and if we can really kind of work together again with that local jurisdiction, there are ways in which to be a little bit creative about that, using things like retaining walls or building structures or out structures as part of the boundary. There are other things that can be interesting too, where the pool itself, if it has an automated cover that works via sensors, that can replace the idea of perimeter protection. We've done that recently, where we've even gotten to the point where there are remote sensing devices that look at water interruption. If someone were to fall into the water, it sets off sort of alarms in the vicinity to alert someone that something's happened. Again, it may not be a child, but it could be something you don't want in the pool. So there are a number of ways to kind of treat these things a little bit differently than what the convention might tell you.
When you are looking at designs and you're trying to meet those regulatory standards as well as aesthetic, how do you accomplish something like that?
And that is kind of the big trick, right? Of course, in a bit of a self-serving way, I would say that good training and experience and creative planning solutions that enter the equation as early as possible in the process are what are really critical. The nuances and complexity anymore of building code have gotten to the point where, to the layman, it can be a daunting task and can get people into a lot of trouble, honestly. What you really don't want to do is begin to go forwards and then have to go backwards, particularly during construction, because the cost can be dramatic. And so, again, early forethought, understanding owner expectations, what the outcome needs to be. And that's not just, the physical outcome. Of course, there are things like schedule and budget parameters and maintenance issues and all those things that need to caretake for the project. But I think when we look at it, we try to really enforce the idea that the earlier the design professional can become engaged to make that a thoughtful process, and not necessarily have to bow to the constraints of the building code as much as just to integrate it as a support to the idea. Like, what's the bigger idea and how do you accomplish that? And then use the code as a vehicle to make sure it performs the way it's supposed to, as opposed to letting the building code be the guideline that dictates the design, because that's really not the intention of the code in the first place.
I like that performance-centered approach. That's a nice way of looking at it. When, like let's take, for example, mounting and lighting. How do you address the challenges of mounting heavy structures in your project?
Well, there's kind of a myriad of those that would enter the equation. But again, I'm going to go back to kind of the source of taking the strategic approach to guide, the efforts of whatever those expectations are. So when you think about a heavy structure, let's say it's a canopy or a freestanding pavilion structure or something like that. What's become very popular, for example, recently are these kind of aluminum shade structures that have integrated lighting and louvers that can close and damper depending on the solar angle or for wind protection. Those are sort of a kit of parts, but they need to be located, and integrated into either a pre-existing structure such as the home itself, or a patio or an area like that. We would always recommend to bring along a structural engineer, and it could be a very minor effort, but to ensure that foundation support or existing building conditions are fully ready to, engage with whatever that kind of heavy structure might be. I think often people think about what we would call gravity loads, or just the weight of the thing itself. But there's much more to it. And particularly in high wind areas or coastal regions, you need to think about wind. You need to think about lateral stability. It can even get into seismic concerns in places. So, there's a broad ranging set of criteria. I think, again, early planning and discussion, particularly with the code official, but also with the home, the owner, the property owner, about what those expectations are and how much disruption or interruption that can create, with the existing environment, the home, the adjacencies. That all needs to be really strategically discussed right at the outset.
How does lighting
play a role in enhancing the functionality of those kinds of designs? And how does it enhance appeal?
Lighting is a kind of a giant spectrum of conversation. I'll try to limit it down to the basics, but I think, fundamentally, we're talking about artificial light, of course, but without illumination, you actually don't have space. You really
Right.
can't perceive it necessarily, tangibly. So the perception of space or the perception of detail or articulation or things like mood are really created through lighting. And the way we interpret that is typically with layers of light. So you may have general illumination for simple functionality. Think of it as enough to kind of get by with things like movement and circulation or whatever the function may be. You may have other layers of light that really are strictly mood driven. Indirect lighting sources or low-level light sources, things like integrated into railing systems or into stair risers, or that are non-direct sources that really just enhance mood. There may be separate layers of light that are specific to tasks. So it may be things like, well, we have a cooking station and we need to think about the illumination of that, or a reading nook, or garden lighting to accent plant matter, trees, what have you. You get into fire features and pools, and there are very many specific sources that can be brought. And you even have to think about the fixtures themselves. Some fixtures want to disappear and just become part of the overall drama of the setting. Other fixtures want to call attention to themselves and maybe be the thing that you're paying attention to. So again, there's a whole spectrum that can be discussed when it comes to lighting. It has also gotten quite interestingly complex with controls and automation and sensors that can really drive those layers and how they work together and integrate into the planning solution.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, lighting has evolved so dramatically in the past 10 to 15 years, certainly with the advent of the LED. The sustainable aspects of it, the durability and endurance of lighting techniques, but also the myriad of ability to manipulate light like we never really could before. So when you think about color temperature or color spectrum, illumination as a, as you said, like an art form, it's no longer simply about just finding a source of light and using that light to illuminate something. The light itself becomes part of the scape. And the ability to manipulate and control that at so many levels is extraordinary, and what it really can do to indoor and outdoor spaces.
So how do you ensure that things like welded joints are safe and reliable during your projects?
Yeah, that's a great call. And I think where you're kind of going with this is twofold. Number one, again, it sort of goes back to our discussions about building code. There are specific testing requirements, standards for welding, particularly when you're talking about field welding. Now, what I mean by that is, let's say we're getting into things like railing systems or, accent components like a trellis or what have you. If the intent is that something is so large or it has to be assembled into pieces that are just not deliverable otherwise, and there is field welding required, there are certain measurable standards for that, and the testing requirements follow what we call the ASTM standards of the American Society for Testing Materials. Those criteria would need to be inspected as that process goes along to ensure that. I can say, but more generally, though, that for many systems, we would certainly prefer a factory welded or factory manufactured system. They're just far superior to attempting to do something in the field. It's just the variables with weather conditions and leaving it to the technician, let's call it, are less preferable. Plus the finish on that material, you're talking about something that it could be, a material that doesn't require necessarily finish, such as aluminum, but for the most part, you're dealing with systems that then have to be finished again in the field. You have to cover those joints with something. So, we're typically trying to specify systems that do not necessarily require that. They come pre-assembled, or they're a kit that is, fastened or bolted together in the field. But again, if you must look at systems that require a weld or multiple welds, I think we need to backtrack into the the safety standards that are a part of that allow it to be tested properly.
So how do you balance that need for durability in an environment and putting sustainability into your projects? There's sometimes those things are opposing forces for design. How do you integrate those kinds of things together?
I think it is ultimately challenging. Again, this kind of goes back to what maybe the owner expectations might be. Where are the priorities? And set those priorities, experiential priorities, but also budget priorities and so forth, and then identify the products, we'll say, that kind of fall from there. I don't think they have to necessarily be opposing criteria. They can work hand in hand, but durability and performance, we tend to think of things as one or the other, but I do think they can work hand in hand. Early investment or longer term return, kind of is a better strategy, let's say, than lower initial investment and shorter return, meaning likely will go obsolete or must be replaced within some certain period of time. I know that's always a difficult challenge for any owner to make that decision. We want the best that we can get at the time. And there are a lot of competing interests as you go into any kind of planning project. Really want the spa with the pool, with the, but something has to give. So I think it really comes down to that choice of where the priorities lie with the owner. It's a decision-making, criteria. I think it goes beyond kind of what we would maybe think of as typical durability issues, things like weatherability. There are things to look at, such as we'll call it security functions or ergonomic requirements, or, like you mentioned, sort of environmental impact over the short and long term. Those are, I think, often criteria that, from an owner's perspective or a provider's perspective, we may not be looking at in the first time cost investment. And that really is what we need to think about. There is a first time cost, but what's it going to run you in 5 or 10 or 15 years? If you're planning, for example, to stay in a home or a place for the duration, let's call it more than 10 years or closer to 20, that should weigh your decision very differently than if you're only going to be there for a shorter period of time, less than 5 years. It may not benefit you to go the extra mile and consider those sustainability or durability issues. I'm not saying that isn't always the right choice, but it may not be someone's priority of choices.
How do you present innovative solutions that kind of answer both things? Is there a good example of a time that you had a project that you were able to do that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm going to kind of make a broad statement, and then I'll get maybe more specific. But it's funny that where we've gone, at least in our practice, the innovative solutions have kind of become going back to common sense fundamentals. We really try to look at, when we're in any planning stage, whether we're kind of starting from scratch or it's an intervention of some sort or just a modest set of improvements, we really do kind of look at the true fundamentals: solar orientation, exposures, prevailing wind direction, the views, the slopes of the site, the topography, the natural ventilation criteria. What's low impact to the site? How do you use natural or sustainable building materials? How do we look at carbon footprint? We've kind of gone back to the basics, I think, and realized that the things we knew and implemented 100 years ago are still as applicable today. Take advantage, let's say, of solar orientation to gain the passive and active benefits of that in the planning of an outdoor space, where we don't set ourselves up to introduce problems that shouldn't have existed in the first place, or the opposite. If you have the choice and you have an outdoor space, let's say with a water feature or a pool, in most parts of the continent, the ideal circumstance is to place that on the southern exposure, and to set yourself up that you maybe can gain the benefits of the passive effect of the sun on the water, as well as on the people inhabiting or enjoying the space. You may be able to have roof structures or elements that benefit the same orientation, where maybe we can then add in either hydronic or photovoltaic solar systems that then either co-generate power, let's say for the devices that serve that outdoor function, like shade devices or a pool pump or circulators, or even hydronic heating for the pool itself or supplemental heat. So again, can we think about complementary kind of pre-existing conditions that we can take advantage of that don't fight themselves? Were you to do the opposite, let's say, and maybe you don't have a choice in a certain situation, but you were to place all that on the north side, well, you kind of remove both the benefit of the passive situation with the sun and the exposures and the gains, and you actually can't take advantage of the other elements either in terms of like, cogeneration, let's call it. We've done that recently, for example, in a project here in Pennsylvania, where the site fortunately lended itself to take advantage of those, to do exactly the scenario I mentioned, where the roof structure of the main residence, we were able to create a dominant south-facing slope, integrate photovoltaic power generation and storage on site, on-prem, and then actually have a pool on that same south corner, take advantage of those exposures, kind of put the two together. We use geothermal. There's a lot of little elements that can be tied together, but I think that's really what it is. Don't fight what nature gives you. It's like the blocking and tackling of architecture. Start there. Yes, let technology and other complementary services enhance that experience, but don't rely on that necessarily to fix all the ails that could have been addressed with creative solutions otherwise.
Just by being thoughtful. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I feel the innovative can be turned inside out, and really mean something like that, bringing it back to basics and perfecting what already exists in a profound way and being thoughtful. I really agree with that.
It's interesting you say profound, by the way. It's, I think, why do we want outdoor spaces in the first place? We are natural beings. We want to be exposed to fresh air and sunlight and the soil and plant matter, and we belong to it. That's why we do these things. And really, again, thinking about these creative solutions that can immerse people into those environments and just bring them to the next level, no matter how big, small, whatever, that doesn't matter. There are creative ways to do that and create wonderful solutions. And I think it's just, it falls back to, as you mentioned, kind of like the profound sense of connection that we want in the first place.
Well, thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
You are very welcome.
So welcome Steve Bonastis, president and owner of Reaction Exteriors LLC, a remodeling contractor on the East Coast.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to talk to you a little bit about what it means to be in the field working with these materials and the codes and all the different quality assurances that you have to put in place. Okay. So let's start with the first question. How do you navigate the complexities of code compliance in retrofitting projects?
So, we have in-house a architect, a structural engineer and an architect that we kind of rely on every day to kind of make sure that we're in compliance when we are talking to our clients and getting their wishes. We interject with putting a plan together, and then that plan gets scrutinized. And of course, before we go on the permitting, that's our check and balance.
So what are the most challenging code issues you've faced, and how did you resolve them?
So, we try to minimize those challenges by putting a good plan together, working with our architect and our structural engineer in-house. That gives us the ability to kind of navigate through the landmines and just put together a plan that will work. So the customer is realistic on what they want to do. And when we go to permitting, it's an easy process for us.
Could you tell me a little bit about modern safety standards and how they've changed your practice?
So it's always for us evolving. Our safety is important for our men. And we look at when we're deciding on different materials to use, especially railing systems for decking, that, we minimize our selections to the ones that we really like. And that's important. So we guide our client to making decisions based on our field experience.
Well, and I know that there's been a lot of safety changes in the last decade or two. The book has changed.
Oh, yeah, that's for sure.
So let's look at mounting and lighting. What are the key considerations when you're mounting new elements into existing structures?
Yeah, so we're a stucco remediation company. So our specialty is integrating good building science, flashing details, and how we mount our lighting to structure are paramount. They're very important. So we emphasize that as in part of our build.
So how do you incorporate modern lighting solutions into older buildings? Could you walk me through a little bit of that?
Well, and I think this is where you're driven. So when we're delaminating and taking exterior cladding down and adding new light blocks or new penetrations into that structure, the flashing details and how we mount these light blocks are important. So that's kind of how we integrate our systems to make sure that the wall drains and dries properly.
So how do you make certain that the materials that you're selecting for these projects are both compatible with the existing structures and meet the current standards?
Great question. We rely on our sales reps to help us with that process. Fellows like Jason that are in our office and others, making sure that we're up to date with the latest and the positives and negatives of these materials. And we can integrate knowing, and our distributors too, honestly, they help us with our selections that we can go out to the client. We do not advertise 30 or 40. We really hone in on 3 or 4 of the best. We specialize in those 3 or 4. And those are the materials that we advocate to our client.
Do you ever have like moments of excitement when you see a new material, like that that's going to make your process better and really give some deliverables to your clients?
Yeah, so I mean, most of our clients really are concerned about the cosmetic look. There's been great strides in some of the materials we use for low maintenance style materials, and we're integrating those in. We have clients that really want an authentic look of wood, but there's some great materials out there on the market now that give us that look. But the low maintenance aspect is huge now.
Yeah, I think sometimes the owners don't think about the upkeep involved in some
That's
of these
right.
beautiful projects. And so when you find a material that makes it easy for them, that's remarkable.
Awesome.
How do you verify the quality and durability? I know it's one thing to hear word of mouth, but is there a material that you love when you work with, that's always been tried and true?
So again, I really rely on my sales reps to educate and inform us. We rely on our distributors too. These materials, there's many to choose from, but we kind of reaction exteriors. We take a look at all of them and try to weed out the ones that we think will be the best for our client, that have good financial component as well, that they're reasonable, and we put it out, advocating those materials.
So speaking of your clients, how do you manage their expectations, especially dealing with limitations like older buildings?
That's the most important here. Without a client, we have nothing. So making sure that we are realistic with expectations. Communication is huge. Making sure that the client is aware of the steps every day. Walking around with the client on our projects, mandatory once a week. You got to walk around with my foreman or with myself, or just to get an understanding of how the project is moving. They can ask questions at that time, and we move through process very, very easily with great communication. So I think that's the most important.
When you're doing those walkthroughs, do they ever ask questions that kind of alter the project?
So, I mean, they ask why sometimes. Why do we do a certain way? We utilize renderings. We utilize pictures in the beginning. So, I'm a big advocate here that let's get a great game plan together. Let's kind of weed through all the selections and such, that we get to a point where we agree on this is the rendering, this is what we want to see, and then we can duplicate it and put it out there and make it happen. It doesn't happen to us that often, honestly. It's more or less just questions about, certain flashing details, or, we do some neat things with bordering decks and stuff. So seams in the field are not there. just things that
Cool.
try to make things a little better, and we bring them out. It's a great advertising tool for me. This is some of the things that Reaction Exteriors does.
Yeah.
Some of the rest don't.
Yeah. Well, and that reputation always matters.
100%.
Though, speaking of better practices, are there any tangible sustainability things that you can put into place as you're doing these builds?
So, we try to manage recycling, manage some of the materials that we're taking off the house, especially aluminum. We can recycle that, and my company does do that. It is not the easiest when you're working with different construction components, but we make it a point here in the office. That's something that we kind of stress here. And it works for our company. We've been doing it so long, it's natural for us. But I think it's important.
Yeah, I think so too. And I love that you've been doing it for a long time, probably even before it was cool.
Well,
So,
for sure. You're dating me.
oh no, not trying to. So when you're looking at really common issues when you're doing a retrofit, how do you resolve them?
Yeah, so we try to discuss the pros and cons. One thing that comes up with outdoor is decking, trying to maintain a framing system that the client feels is in great shape. But for certain products, really not the best framing system for today. We really advocate removing the framing and restarting with brand new framing on decking systems. 12 on center versus 16 on center, and longevity of the deck and how it's going to look. All these things matter, but it's good to talk about it in the beginning. And we talk about the impact of the framing in comparison. And 99% of the time, clients say, take that frame down, let's put a new frame up.
Well, and they probably want a different layout most of the time too.
Sometimes, but cost matters. When we're approaching a project, clients are sometimes looking for a way to cut corners. Our job is to make sure that we don't let them cut to the point of quality. And
right.
We pump the brakes there and say, hey, listen, this is what we recommend. And we may lose a job once in a while, but it's long term. We're married to that deck. We're married to that product. And that weighs on us. We want to make sure that when we're building for longevity.
So how do you handle unexpected discoveries like hidden damage or an outdated infrastructure?
So we discuss it. We take the client, we show the client where the compromise is. It's something that maybe was not identified in an inspection report or such, and we manage it. We put a price tag to it or a financial impact to it, but we will not leave it. It has to be managed one way. And, communication, again, is so key. Having the client walk and see the project on a daily basis or on a weekly basis is important. So it minimizes surprise.
So how do you differentiate your services in a competitive market?
Well, there's a few things we do. We're a little special with Reaction Exteriors. We're really not a sub-based company. All our crews are starting in-house, and they're trained in-house. And I think that continuity makes for a smoother job. Also, time frames and such. We have a huge advantage. Reaction Exteriors is not waiting for somebody to come to our job. We control who's going to the job every day. So
nice.
Projects are more seamless because of that.
So what are the biggest trends that you are seeing now?
From an outdoor living standpoint, I'm going to say outdoor kitchens are huge. Even in a region like mine, where we're really only out there 3-4 months a year, putting outdoor kitchens in are a big part of our company's work. And adding and talking about even overhangs for decks so they can extend their time frame outside. Trying to utilize companies like Phantom for their 3-season drape type motorized pull down systems really add longevity to your outside living. And we try to infuse that into our plan. And that's been the biggest I've seen in our company for sure.
Well, thank you for joining us today. I appreciate you sharing your insights.
Thank you so much.
Is there any piece of wisdom? I know I like to close with, do you have a piece of wisdom that you'd like to share, whether it's regarding decks or outdoor living spaces or personal thoughts?
Find somebody that you can trust that has your best interest in mind. It's not about the sale. It's about the specification. It's about the product selection. It's about meeting not only your expectations, but the client's expectations, and knowing when not to make that sale. For me, I've had plenty of opportunities where I didn't sell something, and I gained more respect from the architect or the contractor because I wasn't trying to sell them something. I was trying to make sure that they got the right product, and it might not have been mine.
Well, and I'd say too, to couple off that, like Steve had said, work with the right people, get out in front and review those projects. I think a lot of the younger generations, maybe from the stats I see, are a little more introverted. They've been living behind a phone or a computer screen for a while. Get out, meet with your clients, set those expectations, work with your local, suppliers, manufacturing reps to find those key relationships and nurture them and work with people that are generally a consultant, not a salesperson.
Great points, both. Thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to joining you on the next episode of the Blueprint of Outdoor Living.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you for listening to the Spec Shaman podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to our show and leave us a review. The Spec Shaman podcast is produced by Laura Elliott and Brad Blank. A huge thank you to our guests who made this show possible. Building product manufacturers who want to increase their specification opportunities, please visit specshaman.com or ronblank.com. Thanks all for this episode, folks. See you next time.